Where to now, Ace?
Home.
Home?
The TARDIS.
Yes, the TARDIS.
By the early 90s, Doctor Who was dead. Sure, it existed in book form, but it was managed by Virgin Publishing. Even its home at the BBC for the last 30 plus years forced it to move on to pastures greener. Or at the very least, they just wanted to get it out of the damn house. But yet, it does survive, and on TV as well. It's made a home not only in the hearts of a new generation, but on a public broadcasting channel some 4,000 miles away. And it's not just shown, it's promoted, it's loved, and it and quite a few other British sci-fi brethren are hosted by a bald bearded man dressed in a suit and a cowl floating around a multicolored, pixelated environment. Sounds like a bad acid trip, but to a 10-year-old it's perplexing and intriguing. It was in September of 1995 that this cult sci-fi show found a place in yet one more home and one more heart. This is the story of Sci-Fi Friday Night.
Villa, put visual survey on the screen.
British science fiction has always had a weird place to play when it comes to marketability. Sets were cheap, time was short, and a lot of the storytelling varied drastically from standardized American sci-fi fare at the time. Think Star Trek, Quantum Leap, and even The X-Files. It also didn't seem to sit well with the idealistic programming PBS stations had strived to procure. Basically, it wasn't like the classic period pieces the BBC was known for producing, and it certainly didn't fit the perceived stigma about what British television was like. It was an outcast, and so it needed to figure out how to broadcast itself to, well, outcasts.
This is WIES-TV in New Orleans. He's been shuttling through time and space for 14 years, solving problems and vanquishing monsters. He was born with 2 hearts and a body temperature of only 60 degrees. He's the astounding Doctor Who. Become part of his fantastic adventures. Join Doctor Who this Saturday at 10:30 p.m.
In 1972, rounds of Jon Pertwee episodes of Doctor Who began to be sold to the States. Not surprisingly, their track record didn't leave much to be desired, but a few positive reviews here and there started to get the ball rolling, and the snowball growing. By the late 70s to mid-80s, Doctor Who began to come into its own on localized public broadcasting stations. With the addition of Tom Baker episodes, new fans jumped on board and helped galvanize the US fan base that would lure cast members, writers, and producers of the series to North American cult conventions.
November 26 and 27 in Chicago, fantasy becomes reality. Doctor Who, the ultimate celebration, featuring live all 4 Doctors, Tom Baker, Peter Davison, Patrick Troughton, and myself, Jon Pertwee. Join us and 17 other stars in celebration of our 20th anniversary.
For tickets, call 3-1-800-543-8800 or send money order $50 adult, $20 children, 5 through 11 to Spirit of Light, 4805 West Irving Park, Chicago 60641.
But, as the 80s came to a close, the BBC canceled the series, and more public broadcasting stations saw that as a bad sign, and began to cancel any renewals on Who. By the early 90s, only a handful of stations really had anything to do with it, and the most notorious of the bunch was Iowa Public Television, and their end-of-the-week marathons called Sci-Fi Friday Night.
Welcome, my friends, to Sci-Fi Friday on Iowa Public Television. I'm Mike Frisby. We begin, as always, with Maestro Horkheimer's masterful presentation of the current state of the timeless. Here's Jack, the Star Hustler.
Starting around 1993, IPTV began to schedule a block of British-centric classic science fiction. While its lineup would change throughout the years, it maintained a staple of Red Dwarf and Doctor Who, back to back, themed with the cunning wit and criticism of one Mike Frisby. In some ways, Frisby became almost as big as the shows he introduced, and certainly in another way, his unique style of master of ceremony was as charming as it was odd. Each story that evening would be treated with...
You know, this web planet is certainly one of the wackiest places encountered in the Doctor's journeys through time and space, and it's starting to bug him, if you get my drift. In tonight's installment, and those yet to come, you will meet more Menoptera, Optera, Zarbies, Troglodytes, and drones than you can shake a can of raid at. Now, director Richard Martin summed it up this way. It should have cost millions. It probably cost hundreds. Well, Martin's probably right, and a New Year's glass with him for budget-stretching ingenuity. Now, you see how doing Doctor Who in sequence provides unique insight into a quarter century of British socio-economic history? You do. Hey, you're ready for Market to Market. And we are ready for the Doctor. Here he is.
In the mid-90s, Red Dwarf and Doctor Who took off and continued to grow while other public broadcasting stations seemingly failed. Annually, these stations would host telethons designed to raise money in support of these shows and procuring even more shows. And every year the donations would pour in. Iowa loved their British science fiction. Sci-Fi Friday Night was a hit, and a local one at that. Because of this, IPTV was able to host more shows with more tales of wonder and began to establish itself as the statewide leader of British science fiction. Shows like Blake 7, Neverwhere, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and even Star 1 had a home.
Kind of a sad Who tonight, friends. A bit of a weeper as Peter Davison's Doctor takes it in the shorts once too often and has to regenerate. Now, this usually meant the BBC was hoping to regenerate audience numbers by switching doctors in mid-season, but it appears that Davison himself was more than willing to call it a day. By now, the show had become an institution beyond much creative input from its star. Davison's predecessor, Tom Baker, probably wielded more influence on scripts and production than any of the other doctors, but his long reign ended with touches of flaccid self-parody, bad feelings, and a determination to revitalize the formula. Peter Davison's relatively brief tenure achieved that sense of rebirth, and it would continue with his successors, although not as easily or successfully. The Fifth Doctor, then, was a pivotal one for the entire series, and tonight we bid him farewell in the caves of Androzani. The beat goes on next Friday. I hope to see you then.
However, as time went on, so did many of its fans, and consequently so did the shows. At the end of the 90s, it was unsure what the future of Doctor Who looked like. In 1996, a television movie had been produced by Fox, and the rights to the series were somewhat up in the air. It was uncertain if Fox, or even then Sci-Fi, wanted the rights to the series, something that would have granted them exclusivity and essentially cut out all other networks. Even the BBC was getting back in the Who game by canceling rights to Virgin Publishing and beginning their own line of BBC official books. But these were big corporations. Stories that were enjoyed uninterrupted by commercials and crass marketing might soon find themselves pitted against other shows on other networks, struggling to compete. That's something that Who didn't really have to do before, and the likes of Frisbee, he'd be the first to go. No more wit, no more heartfelt criticism, no more life. For many fans, i.e. Iowans, this was a tradition. The shows felt incomplete without Mike. It was a small world, one that felt like family, and although the kids were growing up and might not come around as often as they used to, they always wanted to know that it was still there. Still having a laugh. Still waiting around every Friday night with a cup of tea and a tale, regardless of when you last stopped by. But as with all things, it would have to come to an end. And in July of 2008, Mike Frisbee passed away. Although retired at this point, it felt like a final punctuation to an era that upheld Doctor Who and other sci-fi programs when no one else would. The era of quirky, locally syndicated shows was over. We often talk about how we got our start in fandoms, where we first saw a show, what it was, how we didn't know it would become such a huge part of our lives. But I remember my first time watching Doctor Who in the fall of '95 with John Pertwee in Planet of the Spiders. I stumbled across it, as one presumably does, while channel surfing, and I don't really know what made me stop, but I'm guessing it was the flying car. It was there that something clicked, something that clicked so hard that it's stuck with me for 25 years. And while the shows were always the heroes of Sci-Fi Friday Night, it was the unsung hero, Mike Frisbee, that tied it all together. I recently moved into a bigger place and managed to take on a few more of the items from my parents' place. Among those were a plethora of old VHS recordings of Doctor Who, Red Dwarf, Blake 7, and several others. And while it was great to see those episodes again, it also meant that I got to see Mike again, the guy on the TV that hosted these shows. And you can watch all these TV shows now, uninterrupted, no frills, just show. Hell, you can even skip the intros and the credits if it doesn't mess with your marathon. But in doing that, you've lost something. To have Frisbee floating there in all of his Technicolor glory, telling you about a show that you love, that you both love, sharing that connection, even if it was through a curved glass. It's important. It certainly brought me back to those late Friday evenings, lying in my room, lights off, basking in the glow of Sci-Fi Friday Night programming. And as much as IPTV's Sci-Fi Friday Night used to be the home for Doctor Who and other British sci-fi misfits, its memory and stay on television is now at my home. Unfortunately, there really isn't a lot of information out there about Sci-Fi Friday Night. There's an antiquated website at sffn.com that briefly talks about the shows it ran and the programming listed from mid-1998 to 2002, but it's hardly archive material. Fortunately, with my antiquated VHS collection, I managed to keep a firm grip not only on its history, but my history with the programming block as well. Some episodes I can timestamp accurately, but there's no complete collection, and more likely than not, there never will be. So for now, Sci-Fi Friday Night must live on in pieces, and hopefully this video can shed some light on a late-night cult programming staple. It not only was an important part of my personal history, but also the history of each of the programs it strived to promote. And while it's crass to assume that Sci-Fi Friday Night shaped the course of Doctor Who, or any others, it certainly helped, and it certainly made waves in one small corner of the planet. Thanks for watching, and remember,
Till then, be safe. The doctor's in, and I'm gone. See ya.